Our first reading is from Isaiah chapter 53. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see the offspring, and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. The word of the Lord. Our second reading is from Acts chapter 4. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. The word of the Lord. At this time, I invite our children's church volunteers to lead our children to their Sunday school room, which is the council room with the inside of the fellowship hall. So special thanks to our Sunday school leaders today. I invite you to stand as you're able and join me in our gospel acclamation found on page 4 of your worship bulletin.
Our gospel reading today comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10.
Glory to you,
O Lord. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Lord. Please be seated for the message.
Good morning. As Pastor Kelly said, my name is Tim Muth, and I'm really delighted to be with you here this morning. Thank you for the invitation to talk about the global church and what the church is doing in one little part of the world, in the country of El Salvador. I live in Milwaukee with my wife Linda. We attend All People's Lutheran Church in Milwaukee, but 6 months of every year we live in the country of El Salvador, where I do human rights work and where we both volunteer with the Salvadoran Lutheran Church. And you might not have realized it, but you've already had a little bit of taste of El Salvador in this morning's service. Our opening hymn was from the Salvadoran liturgy. And that song is one that I've sung in Spanish many times in El Salvador. It is a favorite of the Salvadoran Lutheran Church, welcoming everybody to the communion table. And what I want to do this morning in our time together is just share with you, through the example of the church in El Salvador, how the church is carrying out the mission of being servants that we heard in today's readings. And in El Salvador, we can find just very powerful examples of faith and witness to the call of the gospel. Now, you might not be familiar with El Salvador. It's a very tiny country. It's about the size of Massachusetts. If you were looking at a globe and took a line directly south of Wisconsin, you would find El Salvador in Central America. And in this tiny little country, I personally have encountered great examples of what it means to be a Christian servant. If you were paying attention to the news this week, you might have heard about El Salvador in the news, because 1 week ago today in Rome, the Roman Catholic Church and Pope Francis declared Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador to be a saint of the Catholic Church. And this was an event that was met with great celebration throughout all of El Salvador and Latin America. And to understand why Oscar Romero is really important, you need to understand a little bit about what El Salvador was like in the 1970s. The country was suffering from tremendous poverty and inequality. There was a group of families called, extended families called the 14 families, who controlled almost all of the wealth. They owned almost all of the land in the country. And the great majority of people lived in great poverty. They might raise a little bit of corn on a little piece of land, or they would work in the sugarcane or the coffee harvest, and earning maybe 25 cents a day during harvest season. So it was a place of great inequality, a great injustice. And the 14 wealthy families who controlled the country, they controlled the government, they controlled the military and security forces, and they used those to keep themselves in power. So in the 1970s, people started to protest, the situation that they were living in. There started to be demonstrations, but the protests were met by violence by the wealthy and the powerful. The army attacked demonstrations. Protest leaders might be kidnapped, tortured, killed. The elections in the country were rigged. So it was in that context, living like that, that Oscar Romero was appointed as the Archbishop of San Salvador, which is sort of the highest church official in the country of El Salvador. Now, as an archbishop, you get to hang out with wealthy donors. You get to solicit artwork for the new cathedral you're building. But Oscar Romero set all of that aside to become what we call in El Salvador the voice of the voiceless. He used his position as the archbishop to denounce what was going on in the country. Each of his Sunday sermons would be broadcast across the country, and he would denounce problems of inequality, of the kidnappings that were going on, of the way the wealthy and the rich were treating the poor. But he didn't come into this position as a champion of justice. It was his encounters with the people, the common people, the people living out in the countryside that really transformed him into their champion. And there's a story that I really love that sort of gives a great example of how Oscar Romero came to love these simple people. And it's a story from one Christmas Eve when Oscar Romero visited a poor community called La Bernal to celebrate with the people who lived there. And this is the story as told by one of the people who was there. After the Mass and First Communion, we fixed up 2 tables, really nice. They were kind of long tables with white tablecloths that hung down to the floor. The children who had received First Communion sat at one table, with Bishop Romero at the head. The rest of the community sat at the other table. Tamales had been made. 2 apiece, said the women who were handing them out. There was 1 regular tamale and 1 sweet one for everybody. Suddenly, a little boy appeared out of nowhere. He was a tiny little kid, about 4 years old, light-haired and covered with dirt, barefoot and with a nose full of snot. He came up to Bishop Romero from behind and pulled on his cassock with his grubby fingers. "You want some?" Oscar Romero asked him. The little boy nodded his head a few times. Yes. This kid was filthy with dirt and stains, but the Archbishop picked him up, put him on his lap, and started feeding him from his tamale. He'd eat 1 bite and give the next bite to the boy. 1 for him, 1 for the boy, 1 here, 1 there. And so just like that, the 2 of them ate tamales together that Christmas Eve. It was encounters like this that transformed Oscar Romero into the voice for the voiceless, a champion for the poor and powerless. And he is somebody that, we can say, well, he was part of the Catholic Church, but the Lutheran Church was celebrating as well last week as Oscar Romero was recognized for everything that he had done in the country. But as happened with Christ, happened with Romero. When you denounce empires like the Roman Empire, or when you denounce the wealthy and powerful in El Salvador, they strike back. After one particularly powerful Sunday sermon, where Romero demanded that the army cease the repression, the next day, an assassin's bullet killed the Archbishop while he was saying Mass. And so we call Oscar Romero a martyr for the faith. And just as we see Christ in the servant passages in the book of Isaiah, so in our first reading, as we heard about the suffering servant, and the church talks about that as a prophecy of Christ, but we can also see in that passage martyrs of the global church like Oscar Romero. Isaiah prophesied, "By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth." So Oscar Romero's assassination in 1980 marked the unofficial start of a civil war in El Salvador, which would last 12 years, from 1980 to 1992. On one side in the Civil War was the government of El Salvador supporting and protecting the interests of those 12 wealthy families, or 14 wealthy families. And on the other side were leftist guerrilla fighters who had decided that the only way to eliminate the injustice was to take up arms. But as is always the case in a war, there are innocent victims, the ordinary people, the peasants, the people caught in the middle, the refugees who have nowhere else to go. And here we find our second example of the global church as servant, as the Lutheran Church of El Salvador responded to the cries of those victims during the Civil War to offer them refuge from the violence of war. So the Lutheran Church in El Salvador is actually a very young church. It was founded in the 1950s by a Lutheran missionary from Wisconsin who planted churches throughout Central America. Well, in the 1980s, during the Civil War, a large group of refugees fleeing from the battles of the Civil War in one part of the country came to the Lutheran Church seeking safety. Now, the Lutheran churches in El Salvador have really very few resources, but they found some money that was originally intended to buy some ambulances, and instead they used that money to buy a piece of property where a refugee camp could be built. And they named that camp Fe y Esperanza, which means faith and hope. And some 500 families came to live in that refugee camp, mostly women, children, and the elderly. And in that refugee camp, they found safety. The families lived in a few dormitory-like buildings, subdivided for the different family groups. All the camp cooking in the refugee camp was done in common, and the families shared all their meals together. There was a nursery, there was a school for children. The women would gather at large cement troughs to wash clothes together, laughing and sharing stories. And the Lutheran Church, in the mission of this refugee camp that they kept open during the Civil War, saw itself rooted in the stories of the early Christian church, as described in the Acts of the Apostles that we heard in the second reading. As we read today, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. And this was really the spirit and the way of life in the refugee camp during those years. A few years later, the Lutheran Church would form a second refugee camp on the shores of a volcano crater lake, and many more people would find refuge there. But siding with the poor and the oppressed is not without a price. As Jesus reminds his disciples in our gospel reading, being a servant can be costly. In El Salvador at that time, to side with the poor was to be viewed as a subversive. A bomb exploded at the Faith and Hope refugee camp. The central church of the Lutheran bishop was bombed, and the bishop, Medardo Gomez, was kidnapped and tortured. He eventually had to flee to Wisconsin to seek safety for a period of time. Lutheran pastors and lay people from Wisconsin went down to El Salvador to accompany the Lutheran Church in El Salvador and to give it the protection of the presence of gringos with U.S. passports. The war finally came to an end in 1992 after more assassinations of priests by the Salvadoran army led the U.S. government to finally stop providing support to the Salvadoran army, and peace was negotiated soon after. The refugees at the Lutheran refugee camps left the camps and returned home. Today, those former refugee camps have been transformed into training sites for organic agriculture and for ecotourism along the lake. But now, today in 2018, there's another type of war and another type of refugee crisis going on in El Salvador and Central America. Gang violence from MS-13 and other gangs is forcing people to flee once again. Warring gangs control neighborhoods in El Salvador in many parts, and to challenge the authority of the gangs is to face death. So the work of the Salvadoran Lutheran Church is once again to stand and care for the victims of violence. With support from Lutheran churches in the U.S., the Salvadoran Lutheran Church has a ministry to migrants, to people who have been displaced by the violence in their country. It's an unfortunate reality that a family might have to suddenly flee its home overnight because of a threat that they receive from the gangs. The church in El Salvador works to try and relocate families to places where they will be safe. And this is not always easy in a very small country like El Salvador. Fearing for their lives, many Salvadorans have fled towards the United States seeking asylum and safety in our country. The people crossing our southern border seeking asylum are not members of MS-13, but they are the victims. The Salvadoran Church, however, knows how dangerous that route north is. They know the likelihood that you will be apprehended and detained crossing the U.S. border, even though you are seeking humanitarian protection in the U.S. So the Lutheran Church has been giving workshops in communities across El Salvador with the simple title, "Migrating is Not the Solution." These workshops try to discourage people from seeking to flee to the north and instead to seek safety within the country. This is one of the areas where my wife and I work in volunteering with the Lutheran Church. Finally, the Salvadoran Church also ministers to people who have been deported from the United States back to El Salvador. As thousands are deported back to El Salvador from the U.S. and Mexico, they arrive back in the country without any resources, without any jobs, without any support from the local Salvadoran government. The Lutheran Church has a program of immediate humanitarian relief, some beans, some corn, some cleaning supplies, some hygiene supplies, things that they can provide to deportees, and also a program of what they call entrepreneurism. It's assistance to help people start up their own little micro businesses so that they can support themselves now that they are back in El Salvador. So how can we help here in the United States with the work of the church in El Salvador? Well, first, simply pray. Pray for the work of Lutheran and Christian churches around the world who are following Christ's call to be servants. Those who are working to alleviate the suffering of the poor and the oppressed, often at great personal risk. So pray for them. Second, we can learn. Educate yourselves about what the church is doing in the world. There are great resources from the ELCA and from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services as a starting place. Read a book or watch a movie about Oscar Romero. Another place you might want to go, you can find this with Google, is my wife has a site on the internet called Linda's El Salvador blog that talks a lot about the Lutheran Church in El Salvador and how partners from the United States walk hand in hand with the church in El Salvador. The third thing you can do is vote. Everybody's vote is important. So look for candidates who support policies which will protect refugees and the poor around the world. And finally, join in. There are opportunities to get involved with the work of the Lutheran Church in El Salvador as our companion synod. There's a companion synod relationship between the Greater Milwaukee Synod and the Lutheran Synod of El Salvador. And right now, we are recruiting volunteers, interested people who would be interested in joining as election observers for El Salvador's presidential election that takes place next February 3rd, and for an annual mission of family wellness and healing that also takes place each February. You don't have to speak Spanish to be part of these. And if you are interested, talk to me after the service or ask Pastor Kelly to connect us, and we can talk more about those opportunities. To conclude, the call of our global church is to open your hearts, open your eyes, open your arms to the poor and to the refugee. There you will find Jesus, in the little boy with dirty clothes who wants to share a tamale, in the refugee family seeking a safe place from those who would persecute them, in the workers of the Lutheran Church in El Salvador and elsewhere, who know the words of Christ, that whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Amen.